Hi, I'm Amy and this is Dad, and we're going to go over how to set up a scope.
That's right. So Amy went and picked up a new scope for her rifle,
Yes.
and this is kind of a big thing for her.
Yes.
So what'd you end up with?
This is the Hawke Sidewinder 30SF. Super
What's the
excited.
magnification on this one?
This one goes up to 32. My
So-
previous one only went up to 16, so this is going to be a big game changer for me.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to be able to actually see the difference in the yardage points.
Oh God, yeah. So one of the nice things about this one, it has locking turrets, which your last one didn't. So to unlock them, you pull the turret up, and that allows you to make your adjustments. So it snaps in pretty good, so you're not going to bump them when you're putting the gun back in the bag, that sort of thing. So it's a pretty nice scope, I got to say. I kind of checked it out a little bit before you did, and it's
Yeah.
cool. So yeah, we're going to go through the setup today. The first step in the process is going to be getting the scope mounted and getting it leveled, and we're going to talk about that as we go through it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I've made up a shim. I always shim the rear scope mount when I'm dealing with air guns, because I always want, with field target we shoot out to 55 yards, we need 30 clicks up elevation generally. So I want to leave as much of that adjustment available as possible, and shimming the back of the scope up helps with that. I'm going to put my shim in there. The other thing I do is there's a stop pin, so I've got a little stopper to keep that from backing out. That'll go in there. And now we can set the scope down in the mounts. And what we're going to do is just install these loosely, because we're going to finish this setup once Amy's in position, so that way the scope is adjusted to her. Now, something I've already done is I've applied thread lock to all the fasteners, so the mounts that are on the gun have already been thread locked, and the screws for the top of the rings has been thread locked as well. So why thread lock?
To help prevent them from backing out with recoil.
You got it. And that's something you really need to check each time you shoot. When you're done shooting, just use a small torque tool. You can pick these up pretty cheap on Amazon, and use that to verify the torque on all your fasteners. So stock screws, scope mounts, all of it. So for example, the scope ring itself, what I'm screwing in right now, I normally set those to 15, and then where the mounts attached to the gun, those I normally set somewhere between 30 and 40, depending upon the mount.
Yeah, we check those after every time we shoot.
Exactly. In order to get consistent performance out of the gun, you've got to make sure that the fasteners are consistent as well. Something else we do is go over the stock screws. There are torque specs for that. Now I think I might have said 15 foot-pounds. That's 15 inch-pounds, and 30 to 40 on the mounts to the gun. Now as I start running these screws in, one of the things that you need to check is the top of the ring. You want to make sure that the gap is even, and there needs to be a gap. You should never have mounts where these two touch. There should always be a gap there. So if you end up with mounts where they're touching, you're going to have to machine it a little bit. So again, we're not tightening these down, just putting them in place to hold the scope. So what we're going to do is we're going to level the scope. So there's a bubble level on the scope, and if you're shooting for accuracy and don't have a bubble level, you're screwing up. You're missing out on some potential accuracy. We don't care if the gun itself is leveled to the scope, but we do care that the scope is level when you're shooting it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a reason for that. Let's say this gun, as soon as the pellet comes out of the barrel on the gun, gravity starts to pull it down. If I shoot the gun on its side, the pellet drops the same direction because of gravity. So whether the gun's sideways or upright, the pellet's going to want to go the same direction, which is down with gravity. So as a result, leveling the rifle really doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
Not with what we're talking about. The scope, on the other hand, that's where it gets a little bit more interesting. So with the scope, you've got your up elevation here. So let's say you've dialed in 30 clicks of up elevation. If the scope is upright, your shot should hit dead center of the target, assuming you're sighted in properly.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say that you turn the scope sideways. So now this is facing off to the side. Where's your pellet going then?
To the side.
Exactly. So that's why it's important that your scope is leveled. Because if your scope is canted off, your crosshairs are crooked, you're going to hit to that side.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've got these in loose. And at this point, I'm going to loosen up the bubble level here that we have mounted on the scope and move it back a little bit so you have some room to adjust. And now what I'm going to do is use this. Let's see here. Yeah, that should be okay. So we're just going to rotate that. Again, I'm not worried about whether or not the gun's level. I'm just worried about getting the scope level. And then I can adjust this one to where they match. So that way I know this level is accurate. So now bubbles in the center on both. Then bump it just a little bit. So one of the things you have to watch out for when you're leveling is that tightening the screw tends to move the bubble.
Yeah.
So here we go, perfect. Right in the center like we want. There we go, awesome. Okay, so now we know that if this bubble is in the center, the crosshairs are level with gravity. Awesome. So what we're going to do at this point, now that we've got this installed, the mounts are a little bit loose to where we can shift the scope as needed. Amy's going to get into position and we're going to go ahead and adjust the scope to her. Now this is especially important in your case because your stock isn't adjustable.
Mm-hmm.
My stock, there's all sorts of adjustments I can make to where it's comfortable to shoot and having it perfectly upright. You don't have that luxury, so we're going to get you to hold it, and if the rifle's canted a little bit, we're going to go ahead and rotate the scope to make sure that's level every time you get into position.
Okay.
Alrighty, go ahead and get into position. Let's see what we're looking at. And just worry about getting to a position that feels good. That work?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, go ahead and pull it from your shoulder. And we'll do the same thing again and just verify. Again, we're not using the level, or you shouldn't be. Just getting comfortable. Feel good?
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay, now look at the level and adjust your position. How's that feel?
Fine.
Okay, so at this point the scope is set up for Amy's position. So when Amy's in position, she cants the rifle slightly to get the correct eye relief behind the ocular lens. So what we're going to do at this point is lock the rifle down. Now, the bubble level on her scope is calibrated to the crosshairs in the scope. We just verified that. So what I did was I just positioned the rifle, canted it over to where the bubble is in the center of the level. And now I'm going to go ahead and tighten down the rings. Now I'm setting these to 15 inch-pounds, and what I'm going to do is a cross pattern. You don't just want to do all one side and all the other. And you want to do it a little bit at a time, because if you do too much on one side, it's actually going to rotate the scope. So we're going to do this and watch the bubble. Now again, this really isn't that big of a deal, because once again, we're not worried about whether or not the gun's level, we're worried about whether or not this is level to the crosshair. So it can move a little bit in this case, and it's not going to cause a problem. So again, I'm going crosswise on this. A little bit at a time on each side so it's nice and even, because we want even pressure put on that scope tube. Because if you tighten these unevenly or too much, you can actually crush the scope tube. If you do that, the first thing you're going to notice is the focus wheel isn't going to want to turn. Now you can go up to as high as about 18 inch-pounds on these in most cases. Personally, I like to stick with 15. These guns shoot 12 foot-pounds of energy, and at that level, I really don't see much issue with scope movement.
Yeah. I don't think we've ever had any of those loose, just the stock screws.
Yeah. Okay, do the same thing in the back mount here. Once we get this wrapped up at that point, so you'll notice I'm turning equally on both sides until I get that click. And going across to make sure they're nice and even. So again, the top ones, 15, 18 at the most. The ones that attach it to the rifle, 30 to 40. If it's small screws, I do 30. If it's the larger screws, I do 40. And you don't want to torque your bubble level, because generally speaking, they're smaller threads than what you have on your scope mounts. All right, and that's it, and that's still dead center,
nice
so
and
you
level.
are good to go.
Yay!
All right, so the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and get it sighted in at 30 yards, because that's your typical zero range. And once we do that, then we're going to come back and we're going to go ahead and calibrate the side wheel here. So Hawke does a really good job. These tend to be fairly accurate, but that said, there's room for improvement. So we're going to make our own scope tape, and we're going to measure different distances and calibrate this wheel to reality so it matches your eyesight.
Perfect.
Now, before we get too much further, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up the ocular lens. So the ocular lens is what adjusts the scope to your prescription, okay? And to adjust the ocular, all you're going to do is you're going to aim at a white piece of paper, something that has nothing on it. You don't want a bullseye or anything like that, because you're not looking at the target. What you're doing is looking at the crosshairs. And you're going to rotate the ocular lens adjustment until the crosshairs come into perfect focus. Now, it's important that when you do this, you make your adjustment, you look away at something at a different distance, let your eyes reacclimate, and then go back to the scope. And you're going to keep doing that until each time you go back to scope, it's immediately clear. Because that adjustment is going to affect the accuracy of your side wheel. So always do the ocular adjustment first, get the crosshair in focus. Don't worry about what you're seeing downrange. Once you have that taken care of, then you can worry about calibrating your side wheel. So we're going to go ahead and move on to sighting this in and getting the ocular set up. And next video we'll go through how to set up your range indications on your side wheel.